Hey everybody, welcome to Reading the Bible to Cats. I almost said reading the Bible to kitties, but either way, we're reading the Bible to Henry as he sleeps. Right, Henry? Well, let's jump into it because this will be a longer one. I'm going to try and read Numbers 30 and Romans 13. Okay, let's just jump in. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said. When a young woman still living in her father's household makes a vow to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears about her vow or pledge but says nothing to her, then all her vows and every pledge by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her father forbids her when he hears about it, none of her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden her. If she marries after she makes a vow or after her lips utter a rash promise by which she obligates herself, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her, then her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband forbids her, when he hears about it, he nullifies the vow that obligates her or the rash promise by which she obligates herself, and the Lord will release her. Any vow or obligation taken by a widow or a divorced woman will be binding on her. If a woman living with her husband makes a vow or obligates herself by a pledge under oath, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her and does not forbid her, then all her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband nullifies them when he hears about them, then none of the vows or pledges that came from her lips will stand. Her husband has nullified them, and the Lord will release her. Her husband may confirm or nullify any vow she makes or any sworn pledge to deny herself. But if her husband says nothing to her about it from day to day, then he confirms all her vows or the pledges binding on her. He confirms them by saying nothing to her when he hears about them. If, however, he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, then he must bear the consequences of her wrongdoing. These are the regulations the Lord gave Moses concerning relationships between a man and his wife, and between a father and his young daughter still living at home. Okay, that's the end of Numbers 30, and that was interesting. I don't know, it's just such a different culture, but vows, obviously we respect vows these days. When you get married, it's a vow, until death do us part, or but it almost seems like these women are just making willy-nilly vows willy-nilly. You know what I mean? It's like, I vow to blah 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 blah, or I don't know, they're just making a lot of vows. But you know what? True confessions, I made a vow and I regretted it. It was, something that I wouldn't recommend people do, especially when you're like near death and you're making all kinds of vows to the Lord because you want to live. This was 2 decades ago, and it's part of my testimony, what you'll hear about in full. But as I said, I'll share bits and pieces along the way, on the way to Ezekiel. But yeah, this vow was, I made some crazy vows. Like, one vow was that I would never be afraid again because I'd faced death, and I vowed never to have fear, which is ridiculous because that's a silly vow, because that's like vowing to be inhuman. I mean, it's not possible. And I left that situation with even more fear. So anyway, that was one silly vow. And then another vow I made, this was like a couple of decades ago. I vowed never to call screen, which was a ridiculous vow. And there were others, but the one significant vow that I really shouldn't have made because it was a really heavy burden on me was I vowed that if I lived, I'd write a book about my experience. And so I lived with that vow, and it was really heavy, and I labored under that vow for years, trying to write a book, which was really, really difficult because I had a lot of trauma. I couldn't push through the trauma to write the book, and then it was just a really difficult. But yeah, it was a rash vow, but I did do it. The whole thing was like 1,000 pages, so it's not really publishable. But I vowed to write it, and I wrote it, and I sent it to. I had a relative who I have a relative who's a writer, and he sent it to his agent, but that was kind of a stupid idea because her genre was crime fiction and really dark crime, and this was a memoir, which was really not in her genre. So she rejected it, and she said it was too much like a diary. But so that with that rejection, I was like, okay, I fulfilled my vow. That's it. Period. We're done. And I just laid it to rest. So yeah, don't make don't. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend making like rash vows like I did, and praying the Lord forgives me all my silly vows that I made. Okay, let's move on to Romans 13. Let everyone be subject. This is Paul writing in Romans. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Oh